All right, folks, welcome to the Fitz News headquarters. It is time for another edition of the Month in Review. And for those of you unfamiliar with this format, this is where we do it live. So, unlike the Week in Review, where we're in the studio and one of us says something stupid, we get to edit it out. This week, we are flying without a net. Always an adventure, always fun, but it's also an interactive way to get folks more involved in the big stories that we have covered over the last 30 days or so. Obviously, a little bit shorter month here in February, but February came with a lot of action, and I'm joined by Dylan Nolan and Jen Wood. We're going to dive right in. So much to cover on the show. We're going to give you an update on a big murder case that we covered. We're going to walk you through a massive federal inquiry down in the South Carolina Low Country. We're going to talk about a big case on the coast that we've been covering for almost a year now, the Micah Miller saga. There's some legal updates there. And our Andy Fancher is going to join us in a moment to talk about the latest badges gone bad here in the Palmetto State. We've got some at the very top of the food chain, some sheriffs who are implicated in some bad behavior, as well as some lower ranking law enforcement officers who've gotten mixed up in some stuff. We're going to go through that and a huge political block where Dylan and I are going to break down a ton of news here in South Carolina and a major nationwide story that's also breaking as we film this episode. But I want to start down in North Charleston, South Carolina. And if you followed Fitz News for any amount of time, particularly over the last 2 years, you know that we've been writing numerous stories related to federal investigations. And I say plural investigations because there are several, and several of them are ongoing. But these investigations involve public officials and others down in North Charleston, South Carolina. This is the third largest city in the Palmetto State, obviously just north of the peninsula, the holy city of Charleston, South Carolina. But it is a massive city government, one of the biggest in South Carolina. But according to federal prosecutors, it's also one of the most corrupt. And we started writing about this story a little over a year ago. And this week, all the coverage that we've been filing over the past few months was laid out in chapter and verse in a federal document that was released related to one of the 8 individuals who have been charged in connection with the North Charleston federal scandal. 3 of those defendants in this case sitting North Charleston council members. So we're talking about 3 publicly elected members of the third biggest city government in South Carolina implicated in this federal scandal. We're talking about kickbacks, we're talking about extortion, we're talking about bribery, all the things that, you hear the words public corruption. This is it, folks, in a nutshell. And Jen and Dylan were both instrumental in our coverage of what happened this week. Jen, I want to start with you. Walk us through some of the alleged schemes unveiled by federal prosecutors as it relates to the North Charleston scandal.
Whew, boy, yeah, this was a big one. We had 8 total individuals tied up in this. 4 of them have agreed to plead guilty, and 4 are facing multiple charges related to these 3 schemes that the feds outlined in this indictment. The first scheme related to the extortion of a local businessman by City Councilman Jerome Hayward. So, according to the indictment in October of 2023, Hayward asked the businessman to donate to his reelection campaign. Um, the campaign of those other candidates, and then offered lobbying and consulting services for this businessman's desired policy changes. So, in exchange for this, he demanded $10,000 upfront and $7,500 per month. And then they negotiated that fee down to $5,000 per month. So FBI was involved in this investigation, and according to the indictment, the businessman cooperated and wired $20,000 in monitored payments to Hayward in March and April of 2024. And then, in return for those lobbying services, Hayward pressured city employees and officials to rezone property, grant licenses, and approve land deals without disclosing that lobbying financial interest.
Oh boy.
Yeah, so yeah, the businessman was unnamed in the indictment, but clearly, played a huge part in this investigation. The
Now, Jen,
next,
hold on
go
just a
ahead.
second. Jen, you mentioned there were 8 folks that were charged. You said 4 have already entered plea agreements. Is it your understanding 2 of those are sitting North Charleston council members, and then the one who didn't plead is
Indeed.
Jerome Hayward.
No, Jerome Hayward pleaded
Oh wow.
guilty.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah. So he did agree to plead guilty in oh, I've got like 8,000 documents open, but
Are
he
you
did agree to plead guilty to charges of let's see, extortion under color of official right and using fear of economic harm, multiple counts of conspiracy to commit bribery with respect to programs receiving federal funds, and honest services, wire fraud, multiple counts of bribery with respect to programs receiving federal funds. And we'll get into those schemes in a minute. And theft from federal funds. So there, I mean, multiple charges he's pleading to. He is facing a maximum term of imprisonment of 20 years and a fine of $500,000.
Oh boy.
So, in addition to Hayward, the other council member that pleaded guilty was Sandino Moses.
Hmm.
And then the other councilman that was charged is Mike A. Brown.
Right, which is
There's
confusing because there's like three Mike
three.
Browns on the North Charleston City Council. This
You
is
got to qualify which Mike Brown you're talking about.
we got to be real careful,
The
Jen.
poor other two Mike Browns, right?
Um, well, Jen, let's get into this because you mentioned the federal component of this. The very first story that we wrote related to the North Charleston scandals involved federal money from the U.S. Department of Justice that was intended to prevent, raise awareness, somehow reduce the incidence of gun violence in North Charleston, which again is one of the pockets of South Carolina where they've had some serious problems with gang activity, gun violence. Or let's not call it gun violence. Let's call it what it is: criminals running wild down there in North Charleston. But some of that money wound up in Jerome Hayward's pocket, according to the federal charging materials. Is that correct?
Yep, absolutely. So, in an effort to reduce gun violence in North Charleston, the city politicians came up with this grant program where they designated $1.3 million in taxpayer money to go to nonprofits in the community to help reduce gun violence. I mean, if you've been reading the news in that area lately, clearly it is not working. And the initial reports were that the Fed started looking into just this unvetted and unmonitored grant money given out, and then stumbled into allegations of kickbacks tied to the grants. And according to the indictment, that is exactly what happened. So two of the nonprofits, Deep SC and Core for Success 2, Deep SC was run by a woman named Michelle Stent Hilton, who also served as Hayward's personal assistant. And the other one was Core for Success 2, who is run by Donovan Laval Moten. Both of those individuals are also charged in relation to the scheme, but they received $100,000 in grants in exchange. So Hayward agreed to go into city council and push those two nonprofits in front of, through council to get these grants. And he received, according to the indictment, allegedly 20% of the grant funds as a kickback for each of those
Unbelievable.
grants. That would be $20,000 per grant. And then he laundered those funds through Lorenzo Financial Services, run by Rose Lorenzo, who is also charged.
Yeah. And real quick, I want to credit, obviously, Fitz News has done the lion's share of the work regarding this investigation as far as what the feds were focused on. But I do want to credit the Charleston Post and Courier for doing the initial report on that gun grant program. Their reporters did a wonderful job exposing that process and the lack of accountability at the city level for it. And obviously, they were a little behind the curve on the investigation, but they got a lot of that coverage out early, and so credit to the Post and Courier for their work on that. Jen, I want to ask you about a component of this investigation, and we're going to get into another phone-related aspect as we continue this conversation. But let's talk first about Jerome Hayward. Clearly, the federal charging sheet referenced conversations with Hayward. This guy's phone was obviously tapped. They were gaining information from him. Do we think he knew this was happening, or do we think that his phone was tapped without his knowledge? I mean,
I
because
mean, I have to wonder if he knew just based on things that he said after we wrote a story indicating the possibility he was under federal investigation.
I mean,
You
we
know,
called this out in February of last year, and the taps didn't start until April that year. Why would you
right.
have those discussions if you thought you were the subject of a federal probe?
Right. He was talking to another council member about, when one of the schemes did not go through the way they were going to, they were discussing ways to keep getting money from out of the scheme and out of this company, which, you know, it shocks me. And
Yeah.
yeah, it's wild.
Well, and to be clear, as we mentioned earlier, this investigation is ongoing. There are other individuals and other components of it that Fitz News has also covered, which we have not yet seen the fruit born related to those allegations. So certainly we're going to continue to keep tabs on the latest. But there is a connection with this story, allegedly, to another big scandal in the South Carolina Low Country that, according to our sources anyway, has the potential to be even bigger than this North Charleston scandal, which again was huge statewide news all across South Carolina this week after we exclusively reported it. But we're referring, of course, to the January 2023 death of an attorney in Charleston. And I want to go ahead and say this for folks listening. He was a good friend of mine. He and I went back a long way back to, again, my first few years in the political world. And I'm referring to David Ayler, a prominent attorney in Charleston, South Carolina, who died on January the 2nd of 2023 in relation to a suspected fentanyl-related overdose. And there is an alleged tie between this investigation and the broader investigation into David Ayler's death and his phone, which was again seized by federal authorities very early into the investigation related to his death. That phone, we are told, has been a gold mine for federal prosecutors and for federal investigators as they seek not only to uncover this drug network down in Charleston, but also potential allegations of political corruption. And Jen, the other big news out of Charleston this week, you wrote about it in your coverage. It wasn't just this investigation blowing wide open, but there were target letters dropping in Charleston um, like the snow from last month. I mean,
And
they
they're
were
like
coming down.
rain and target
It was a
letters.
blizzard of target letters down in North Charleston. Dylan, let me ask you this. You were down there at this press conference. Did it seem to you the local media was up on what was happening as you were covering this event?
So Jennifer, I think literally the instant these indictments were entered into Pacer, which for folks that don't do this professionally, this is the federal system where you can go and access indictments. You already had them downloaded and you were writing exactly about what you just spoke about. The other folks seemingly did not have access to this information yet. They knew that there was a press release sent out by the United States Attorney's Office, and I think that's all they knew because I was listening to folks from various television stations getting calls from their news director like, "What's this about?" And they were answering, "I don't know."
Well, Dylan, there was a big federal presence down there. Obviously, we saw the acting U.S. attorney, and this is happening in a transition period, by the way. It's important to mention this for those of you who follow federal prosecutions. They are led by a U.S. attorney for a particular district. Here in South Carolina, there's one district, the District of South Carolina, but this announcement came a week after that prosecutor announced her termination. That was the word she used, departure.
And I think it's so funny because we have a lot of folks who just aren't informed who are like, "Oh, wow, Trump's really going after these North Charleston corrupt guys." It's like this investigation was done 90% during Joe Biden's administration. Believe it
Yep.
or not, there are still apolitical, aspects of the law enforcement communities despite the gross politicization we've seen in recent years, but this is a by administration investigation and prosecution.
Correct. And it was money that was appropriated by the Biden administration, which is under scrutiny. And obviously, Emily Limehouse, I believe, was at that event too, Dylan, the prosecutor in the Russell Laffitte case. We'll be seeing a lot of her this year as we cover that story. But Dylan, as you were there watching the feds discuss this inquiry, they were pretty aggressive in their language, weren't they?
They certainly were. I mean, they were warning any, would be near to well public official that they will be coming for them next if they catch on to any similar schemes. And just knowing what we know, I don't think that these guys are the only people in South Carolina pulling schemes like this.
Yeah, no, that's for sure. That is for sure. Well, we will continue to follow this. As I mentioned, there are a number of folks who have been implicated in connection with this particular investigation who were not named in the charges that were filed this week. So we'll keep tabs on that, as well as I mentioned that broader investigation into the death of David Ayler, his cell phone, and some of the high value targets that we are told could be at the
I,
center.
I was very interested to see that Hayward was pleading guilty, because if you look at the scheme, like all of these crimes tied to this, he appears to be the ringleader. So what is he exchanging for that guilty plea?
Well, and hey, Jen, that's a good point. We pointed out, we did a story just a few weeks ago before these announcements were made by federal authorities where Jerome Hayward apparently spent 9 hours with them providing information. So I guess he
Singing
didn't
like
sing
a
his way
canary.
completely out of trouble. We'll keep tabs on this. I want to shift gears here. Talking about another huge story this past week. It just continues to snowball, this Micah Miller saga. I tell you guys, when we broke this back in May of last year, a few days after Micah Miller's death, I don't think any of us had any idea the full on, just, I mean, this thing just keeps blowing up on every level. I mean, it is one of the biggest things we've ever covered. But this week, there were several legal developments related to Pastor John Paul Miller. And you want to talk about federal investigations, ongoing federal investigations? He is at the middle of a big one. So far, all we know is that it involves allegations of interstate domestic violence, but we're told there could be a lot more to the investigation of John Paul Miller, the founder of Solid Rock Church in Myrtle Beach. He is the husband of the late Micah Francis Miller, an aspiring missionary, worship leader who was found dead of an apparent suicide up in a state park in North Carolina last April. Now, scrutiny on John Paul Miller has been constant since Micah Miller's body was found. And there are folks who have pointed out some very troubling components to this story. The fact she served him with divorce papers literally 2 days before she died. There's been video of her talking about speaking to federal agents about what she knows about him and his business dealings. But just a crazy story, Jen. But bring us the latest. There was a big lawsuit filed against John Paul Miller this week, and
A
it's significant.
huge,
Walk
huge
us through it.
lawsuit. Yeah. So on Tuesday, February 25th, a lawsuit was filed in Horry County Court, down where John Paul is living, where Micah lived, alleging John Paul sexually abused a woman, Jane Doe, in both 1998 and in 2023. So, two instances of sexual abuse. The first one was when she, I believe, was 15. I have to double check that. But um, yeah, and it was filed by the same attorney who is handling the Morning Star Ministries abuse case, Randall Hood out of Rock Hill, which I tell you what, I've read through this lawsuit page by page. I have seen his work in the past, and he is not an attorney I would want coming after me when it
Yeah.
comes to claims like this. And in looking at this lawsuit, they didn't just sue John Paul, they sued his father, alleging that they had a duty to protect minors and failed. Years of failures, it's alleging. That they had the opportunity, they knew John Paul had issues with this and covered it up. They're alleging that they did nothing. They made the church structure so that nothing would happen to him.
Yeah, and these allegations in this lawsuit against John Paul Miller, filed by this Jane Doe one, these allegations are very similar to the allegations against the Morning Star Church. And for those unfamiliar, our Callie Lyons has published several reports regarding Morning Star Ministries. It's a church based out of Fort Mill, South Carolina, where a worship leader there, a youth worship leader, has actually been convicted, or rather, I'm sorry, he pled guilty. Wasn't convicted, but he pled guilty and is serving a lengthy sentence in the State Department of Corrections for sexual abuse of multiple young people. And the church, once again, in this case, according to the legal filings, conspired to cover it up. Um, so, Jen, as we look at these cases and Attorney Hood, who is bringing them, John Paul is at the center of a phalanx of legal actions, though. Also, this past week, our Cali Lyons filed a report where he is alleged to have tried to intimidate and basically bribe a witness, telling her he would drop his case against her if she testified on his behalf in some of these cases. John Paul appears to be losing a lot of his allies. We did a story earlier this month about a Myrtle Beach businesswoman named Tina Corley, who had been seen with John Paul Miller at the Solid Rock Church, who accompanied him and his former lawyer. It's important, I think, to point that out, Russell Long, when he was arrested last November for assault. Tina Corley, on her social media in the aftermath of this lawsuit being filed, said she stands with Jane Doe. A very significant development there. So we're going to keep tracking these cases. I want to thank Jen and Callie for their work on those. Dylan, if you could let Andy know, we're getting ready to dive into some of his stuff. But before we bring Andy in to talk about some of these badges gone bad, Jen, let me ask you about the possible repercussions for John Paul Miller, for Reginald Wayne Miller, for their churches. This is significant liability that they've been exposed to. Is that correct?
It is significant liability. And in the filing, they also included two exhibits. The first one was the affidavit filed by John Paul's first wife, Allison Williams. And the second one I had not seen before, which was the affidavit that Reginald Wayne Miller's wife, Susan Miller, filed at the time of their divorce. And it was hard not to notice the similarities between the two women's affidavits, just ongoing, you know, allegations. I mean, I don't know if they're in an affidavit, it's an allegation, but, ongoing stories over and over of sexual abuse and cover up, subsequent cover up. And, that the affidavit of Susan Miller, when I read through it, actually made me quite sad because you saw a lot of what Susan said John Paul went through while he was growing up, and I don't think it was a very happy place to grow up. It was sad to read. I mean, doesn't give
Yeah.
him an excuse, but
Well, and his father, again, as you and Callie have meticulously covered over the last few months, his father, no stranger to these very types of scandals, and I think this lawsuit by Attorney Hood, I think, is really going to be revealing, particularly when they get into depositions and start putting some of these folks on the
yeah,
mic and on camera and asking them some of these tough questions. But we will continue to track that case. Again, the Micah Miller saga really continues to generate all sorts of attention and scrutiny as it relates to these court cases that we've been tracking. Jen, thank you, and thank Callie. I know she's out this
she's
morning,
not
but
feeling great this morning. She was
thank
really
her for her
excited,
work.
but I will.
She's done a great job on this. I want to bring our Andy Fancher in with the Dallas Cowboys cap. You got to love a guy who's still true to the team. Andy and we've had a tough go. He's a Cowboys fan. I'm a Colts fan. So it's been a difficult time for the two of us. But Andy, I want to bring you in. It was another busy month for badges gone bad in South Carolina. And this month we had a few high ranking law enforcement officers that came on your radar. Tell us about some of that.
Ooh, I tell you, growing up, I loved Western films, and I felt cheated. I thought I was born in the wrong generation because those days were behind me. Just the most preliminary look at South Carolina law enforcement would indicate that the Western traditions are alive and well here in South Carolina. As you noted, it was a very big month, not only for sheriffs across the state, but as well as their penis wielding subordinates, which we will get into that later. Just a quick anecdote, just preceding that.
Tell us you're not going to show us any penises, Andy.
I don't want to see any more cop penises. How about that? The amount of sex crimes that I've seen lodged against cops in this month alone, I think totals all that I saw in all of last year covering Badges Gone Bad. But before we get into that, we might as well take a tour across South Carolina's at least most notable sheriff's departments this month. And that would start with a frequent flyer of the Badge Gone Bad series, Charles Chucky Chuck Wright Jr. So our outlet has exclusively, and as far as I'm concerned, the only one to report that Spartanburg's for the longest time, untouchable sheriff, who for the past 2 decades has sidestepped allegations of what do you call it, Will? Fascism,
Rolling fascism.
authoritarianism, just
Yeah.
the whole 9 yards. This fella, at long last, is under an active and ongoing criminal investigation. And just as with every media inquiry I've ever sent to the man, he did not respond. No shock there. Now, if you want, I mean, I can recap the deluge of issues that it has taken to get to this point, but it seems almost repetitive. I mean, how many times do I have to come on this show and say, Chuck Wright has allegedly failed again? Chuck Wright has not responded again. I mean, at what point in time does this guy take a look in the mirror?
Well, I know the nepotism story that you broke is a big one, and that's apparently a big part of this. Is that consistent?
A major contributor? Yeah. So it's funny that he was able to sidestep all of these allegations for 2 decades, and then on January 1st of 2024, he deputizes his son, Jared Andy Wright, and all of his problems that came with him, and that appears to have violated nepotism laws that the sheriff should know about. And that landed him in the crosshairs of a civil investigation by the, the Ethics Commission.
Yeah, state
and
ethics,
it's worth noting about this too. As soon as we popularized the idea of reporting accurately on Charles Chuck Wright, the Post and Courier got involved, and then they, to their credit, published a magnificent piece on him overspending with his county credit card because, my personal and my and the county's is both red, so I accidentally overspent $53,000 on the county credit card. Here's what I will flick Post and Courier a little bit in the head about. We were the first to report on the ethics investigation. We were the first to report that there was a disturbance in the force. We were the first to report that there was a civil investigation. They have yet to credit us for any of that. And I don't expect that we will. Yet whenever we refer to the county credit card and the overspending, we give them tons and tons and tons of credit. But who disseminated the investigation? Who made it cool to talk about Chuck Wright?
That'd
Fitz
be you,
News.
Brother Fancher.
Well,
That'd be
Fitz
you, man.
News, Badge Gone Bad. So nonetheless, in the past, since January of this year, he has since been sued by his own former lieutenant. And I'm going to pull up a portion of that lawsuit here. And of course, that lawsuit relates to, or contributes large in part to him deputizing his son in that highly photographed ceremony that, again, appears to violate nepotism laws, the South Carolina Ethics Reform Act from the 90s. So in our own publishing of that lawsuit, a recent lawsuit filed by former SESO First Lieutenant Jeremy Byrd claims he raised concerns about the, quote, appearance of impropriety, potential nepotism, and preferential treatment following Andy Wright's hiring, only to face swift retaliation, wrongful termination, and defamation at the hands of his sheriff. So that's Spartanburg County. And I'd love to spend more time on Spartanburg County, but the problem is we've got so many more sheriff's departments that we need to get into. So while we're touring here, we might as well head to the Low Country, where we have a fella who will, you reported on this man for years prior to me even knowing his name. And that would be former Colleton County Sheriff Robert Andy Strickland Jr., arrested and charged with domestic violence for a second time this month. As if you allegedly didn't learn the first. Well, actually, no, it's not allegedly because he pleaded guilty to it. But it was the charge was.
It's on the record.
Yeah, it was pleaded down. The whole reason that Andy lost his sheriffship is because of that first domestic violence incident, right, Will?
That's right.
And that landed a suspension by the governor, That prompted an AG's investigation that led to, 15 grand jury charge? I mean, insane.
Yep. And he was also placed on probation,
Right. And that's
which
kind
could
of
play
gets
into
into
what
what
you're
we're
about to
talking
tell
about
us.
here. Right. Yeah. Because he was placed on, and let me refer to my notes, because usually I come in without any notes. I understand the content, but when you're dealing with so many negligent law enforcement officers, unfortunately, I need to refer to notes on this specific occasion. So, yes, let's see. Already on probation for misconduct in office, assault and battery in the third degree, and breach of trust with fraudulent intent. It appears as though in his second domestic violence arrest, he has violated the conditions of his probation.
Mhm.
And I would love to show you his mugshot rather than this wonderful headshot of him donning his colors. But unfortunately, the detention center later confirmed with us that we don't have the mugshot. And
Ooh.
that contributes to the larger issue
Did
that
it
I had.
disappear?
Even the
I'd like to get my
charges,
mugshot to disappear.
his charges never made it into the public index, at least
How
at
do
the
you get
time of
that
our
deal?
reporting. The charges were not in the public index. His mugshot was not on arrest.org. It was finally actually, Jen, me utilizing VineLink, where there was a indication that he was released from jail that all but substantiated that he was arrested for something. So it took a FOIA. It took more. It took a hell of a lot more time than it should to confirm that Colleton County's former sheriff was arrested for a second time with DV. Now, as it appears as though he's violated the conditions of his probation, I don't know where he stands on the legal front. Hell, he could be incarcerated right now. But how would we know? I mean, it took how long, Will? I mean, it took me about a week to
You were pulling
substantiate the
teeth on
first
that
arrest.
story, man. You were pulling teeth.
Right.
Shouldn't have been that hard to get that basic information. But yeah, this is a guy who, and again, we got to know the Colleton folks really well a few years back during the Murdoch trial. And yeah, they were the lead agency in that investigation, or at least let me rephrase that. They were the first responding agency. But yeah, they were familiar with us largely from our coverage of their former boss, Sheriff Strickland. And apparently this latest incident will land him under the scrutiny of the state Triple P, the probation, pardon, and parole department. I'm not sure if there's a warrant already out, but you don't have to look at that charging sheet for long to know that this guy's violated the terms of his probation. So I would
Yeah.
expect him to be remanded to SCDC at some point. We will obviously keep our folks in line. But yeah, another fallen law enforcement leader here in South Carolina. But Andy, it wasn't just the bosses in trouble this month. Bring us back to the eggplant emoji drama that you've been talking about. And please, for our viewers, let's keep it to eggplant emojis as opposed to actual hot tub pictures or anything like that.
Oh my God, I forgot all about him. About former Deputy Brown. That's right. Yeah, explicit hot tub pictures amid animal cruelty. I heard there was some discussion of him actually coming back to the Lawrence County Sheriff's Office. Which, hey, I've been needing a grand return to the Sheriff's Department that made badges gone bad. Chaired by the same sheriff, reelected. Anyway, that's a whole different story for a whole different day. Before we get into the emojis, though, a few honorable mentions from the bosses, from South Carolina sheriffs. So, whereas folks like this are resigned from office, you've got, and I hate to point fingers at the voters, but voting is very important, y'all. And while we're in the Low Country, we might as well honorably mention Chris Malfris. It is beyond me that a man could get expelled from office amid a SLED investigation only to get reelected. This is, you've got sheriffs who allegedly don't know the law. You've got sheriffs that can't manage their own house. And you've got voters who don't look into their own sheriffs. And that trickles down into the eggplant emojis that we have here. If you can't manage them from the top level, it's only going to get worse. And I feel that our Badges Gone Bad series says that rather impartially with receipts and photographs and testimonies. What more do you want explicit hot tub pictures? We've got that too. So nonetheless, now that we've cleared that up.
I saw Jen's eyebrows raise there. Jen, you look like you wanted to see
it
that
doesn't
hot
raise
tub picture.
eyebrows, Jen. I most certainly did not. So now leading into the eggplant emojis, and it's funny. Usually I designate the the porn XXX emojis for just the most grotesque of cases, but I've used the XXX on 3 different covers this month. So in the month of February alone, all right, kicked off with Cornelius C.J. Barr of the Dillon Police Department, accused of, and I love that the probable cause affidavit used willfully exposing his penis while standing inside of a sauna on recording, later posted bond for that. And I thought that that was going to be the end of it. But his alleged willful exposure of his penis was just the beginning here in South Carolina. McCormick Police Department officer Matthew Yon, accused of exposing the same organ on duty in his squad car. All right, that's according to probable cause affidavits. He posted bond after his arrest.
Was he taking a leak or what was he doing?
Well, they noted that they used body camera video to substantiate the allegations that he may or may not have been meeting with a woman, which is fine if you're not on duty, if you're not using taxpayer-funded resources to do that. And the deployment of the body camera videos to substantiate allegations, according to probable cause affidavits, didn't end with Mr. Yan, because come last week, I had to revisit the Anderson County Sheriff's Office for yet another allegedly negligent school resource officer. In December of last year, we reported on Charles Wallab, who was recorded assailing his son on a doorbell camera video, and that led to no punishment at all. In fact, the story was that he very narrowly avoided charges by SLED, and that it was the solicitor who ultimately said, "Oh, there's nothing in this
He
video
was
that I
disciplining
have,
the child.
yeah, that suggests he was a bad father." So even though SLED spent months investigating that, even though Charles Wallab was terminated for reasons involving misconduct, which props to Anderson County Sheriff's Office for doing that, because usually we just see deputies exposed for reasons not involving misconduct, and then these transient officers go somewhere else. So Anderson County Sheriff's Office, to their credit, they don't do that. They terminate you for reasons involving misconduct. So if you're a negligent officer, you might not want to transfer over to ACSO. But nonetheless, that was the cutaway. Nicholas Kane Posey returned to the private sector last week after they accused him, SLED did, of engaging in sexual relations with a high school student. And if that weren't bad enough, over the weekend, we got a Georgetown County deputy charged with misconduct. We had Deputy Cody Bailey, all right, engaging in sexual activity, again in his patrol vehicle, with a woman he met through an online dating website. What's pathetic is that South Carolina officers, the ones I report on, that there are so many to report on that it is keeping me this busy. I shouldn't have a pile of sheriff's papers before me. In fact, I mean, there was a 4th sheriff that I didn't even get into. I mean, at what
All
point
in one
time?
month.
All in one. At what
All in
point
one
in
month.
time do voters do something? Do legislators do something? At what point in time do sheriffs do something? I'm waiting patiently, but I'm not an optimist, which I guess is why there's a Badge Gone Bad series, and I guess there's a reason why a Badge Gone Bad series is doing so well.
Well, Andy, I would suggest, based on this month's reporting, that you might consider a spinoff, Badges Gone Kinky.
It sounds almost complimentary, and I don't want to. I don't want to give
His
them too much.
OnlyFans page.
I don't want to incentivize them already.
That is fair enough. Well, man, I tell you, I love it. Truth to power is never an easy thing to do. It's often a little harder when the guys you're telling truth to are carrying the guns. But brother, you have been doing it ever since you got here. Loving this reporting. Excellent work this month. And as I have noted from the beginning, Fitz News always been supportive of law enforcement as a core function of government. But if you abuse that public trust and those public resources, we will come down on you like a hammer. And that goes for any law enforcement here in the state. So, Andy, excellent work, man. And keep us posted on the status of those investigations as they move forward.
If I may add one little thing here, right?
Please.
Right. Rely on Fitz News, all right, to bring you the truly independent and unapologetic coverage of these stories. And it's worth noting, too, you see Post and Courier reporting on stories such as Chuck Wright. Eventually, MSM did pick up on Andy Strickland's arrest. But then you see MSM failing, which is actually where we get into the sheriff that I forgot to talk about. And it's worth mentioning him because nobody, not even Fitz News, has talked about this story yet. While it happened in January of this year, we did not receive the pertinent tip until February of this year, thus qualifying for a month in review. So WIS, my former employer, did a sweeping expose on this nightclub shooting that occurred January 19th, 2025. It was a shooting at the Room Service nightclub on Two Notch Road. Shots fired, and we were deployed to a fight in progress. And you would think, reading this story, that MSM did their job, that they covered it to the fullest extent possible. Well, what WIS, and I hate to keep on working for WIS. I mean, I already gave them how many years of my life, but somebody clearly didn't do their job here, because one of the suspects, one of the two people arrested, who they lay blame for leaving bullet holes in 4 people, is this individual, Christopher Fair Dixon, 30 years old. Why did MSM fail this story? Because Christopher Dixon is the son of former Chesterfield County Sheriff James J.D. Dixon, according to his bio, the first African American elected to the county. Don't you think that's a significant anecdote? Don't you think MSM should be doing a better job covering these stories, covering the relations that some of these suspects are having? But no. So leave it to Fitz News. And now I'm done.
Get it off your chest, man. I love it.
I had
love
to.
it. Well, and definitely you said it there, man. Leave it to us, because we will, again, as I mentioned, bring that hammer down when law enforcement's behaving badly. But thank you very much, Andy. And Andy and Jen, thank y'all for everything this week. I am going to let y'all get back to work while Dylan and I shift our focus now on the show to politics. So thank you, Jen. Thank you, Andy. And Dylan, man, I don't even know where to start. There's so much happening in the political world here in South Carolina and nationally. And again, we always talk about how important the connection between those two is. The Palmetto State's starring role on the national political scene, not only in the Palmetto State elected officials who play such a prominent role nationally, but also our key primary process for both Democrats and Republicans in picking presidents of both parties. But Dylan, I want to start this week. There were some big news developments related to the story of Nancy Mace, the first district congresswoman from South Carolina. Nancy Mace, one of the 2 top front runners for governor of South Carolina in 2026, and her speech on the floor of the U.S. House, U.S. Congress. Her speech this week was, or this month rather, the biggest development in South Carolina politics that we've seen in some time. Nancy Mace gave a passionate address from the floor of the U.S. House, accusing 4 individuals of being sexual predators, one of them her ex-fiance. Now, this was a speech that was widely heralded, promoted by her office. Copies of the speech were leaked before it was given, and there has been massive promotion of the speech since it was given on social media, on Mace's various well-trafficked social media accounts. But this week, Dylan, we saw some pushback from some familiar names. Eric Bland and Ronnie Richter, 2 attorneys who are well known to our audience for their involvement in the Murdoch saga. But Eric Bland and Ronnie Richter representing one of the individuals accused of being a predator by Nancy Mace. And they fired back this week, Dylan, with a letter basically telling Mace, show us your evidence or issue an apology and a retraction. Otherwise, we are going to, quote, test the limits of your protected speech. And that's a reference to members of Congress ostensibly having protection from liability for any remarks they make on the floor of the Congress. Some of us suggested that's why Mace decided to issue those allegations from the floor of the House. But Dylan, this story just continues to dominate coverage here in South Carolina, and Mace now being put in a position where she's going to have to produce some receipts. Is that your take on the situation?
Well, it's interesting if you notice this was an open letter. An open letter is certainly not a legal filing. This is the warning shot in the legal world.
Yeah, yeah, but they did make it clear in that letter that if one of those two things doesn't happen, either evidence produced or a retraction and apology, that there will be a filing. So certainly we're going to keep an eye on that. Eric Bland, not one to bluff, Dylan.
Yeah, I don't think this is a bluff at all. I don't see Nancy issuing a retraction or an apology because why would you make such bold statements about somebody like that only to walk it back 2 weeks later unless she has an attorney tell her that this is like her only option forward. But it's the strongest pushback possible that this one individual who's been accused is doing, and we'll see if this ends up going to court. It would not surprise me at all if this goes from a letter sent outside of the legal system to a filing in a court, either at the state or federal level here shortly.
Correct. And it wasn't just Brian Musgrave, the individual represented by Eric Bland and Ronnie Richter. It wasn't just Musgrave firing back, but Eric Bowman, a Charleston businessman, former owner of the Charleston Battery athletic team down there. He's been firing back on social media, accusing Mace of being engaged in a conspiracy with his former wife, who apparently runs a company that does some contract work with the Veterans Affairs federal agency. He has taken to social media to push back very aggressively against Nancy Mace. And we filed a report just this week related to this massive pushback. And Dylan, context matters here. Not only has Nancy Mace become one of the most vocal, recognizable, well followed members of Congress. She's all over the talk shows, prominently inserted into multiple high profile, hot button debates. But as I mentioned, she's also one of the two top contenders for governor here in South Carolina. Let me ask you this, Dylan, how do you see this having played out for her politically up to now? How do you see it playing out politically for her moving forward?
I think her calculus was right in that this is something that potential primary voters, especially female potential primary voters, seem to have responded well to. And I'm not talking about people who are really dialed into politics. Almost everybody I know who is really dialed into politics is not a fan of this move. But I've seen a lot of people who are kind of tangentially related, the kind of people who might only see 5 minutes of intense political coverage between election cycles. I think that this has a lot of ability to appeal to them. That being said, I believe that Nancy did not get the amount of coverage on this that she wanted. She was clearly shopping this around to various news outlets before she took to the well of Congress. And I think a lot of print publications certainly did publish, but we all know Nancy loves cable television. I mean, she's on cable television prolifically, probably out of everybody in Congress. She's one of the best at getting airtime on cable television. But it seemed like a lot of those cable networks did not give her a ton of airtime simply because of exactly what we're talking about right now, which is the legal exposure. While she is in the well of Congress, she has these protections that are defined in the Constitution. But if you are MSNBC or Fox or CNN, it's not likely that that protection extends, when you have a member of Congress on your airwaves. And so I think that she might not have gotten the amount of reach out of this that she wanted for that reason. And I think that the calculus right now, if this situation stops today, I think this is a net plus for her.
Okay.
But if this drags her through years of going through the mud, uh, and it doesn't end up with her bringing out the receipts and people going to jail, this could end up being a net minus. Now, it really comes down to, does she have the receipts she says she has, and will she be able to put these things on public record? Because right now she's made a lot of claims that are very serious.
Yeah, and it was an incredibly passionate speech. You and I both watched it. I mean, it was incredibly well delivered. And one of the things I wanted to point out in the letter that Eric Bland and Ronnie Richter sent, they noted, I think the quote was, "We are struck by your conviction that something inappropriate happened to you and perhaps to others." They're just saying it has nothing to do with their client, Brian Musgrave. And obviously, Eric Bowman, one of the other individuals mentioned, has come out and strenuously denied the allegations against him and her former fiance, Patrick Bryant, who, as of this writing, is the only individual named in connection with any sort of criminal investigation related to this. And I think that's important to talk about too, because these allegations, when they were made, obviously, like most media outlet in South Carolina, we immediately started calling law enforcement contacts to say, "Hey, what's the deal?" 2 hours after the speech, the state law enforcement division here in South Carolina, SLED, issued a statement confirming that they had been conducting and were still conducting an investigation into these allegations. It was a referral, according to SLED, from the U.S. Capitol Police, and they specifically named Mace's former fiance, Patrick Bryant, as a subject in the investigation. Now, we are told that that is not an exclusive statement, that he was named as a subject, but that there could be other subjects. Again, it has not been specifically limited beyond uh, that. Patrick Bryant is simply the only name that they have released publicly. But we are told that the investigation could involve others. Mace certainly put their faces and pictures up all over social media, all over the well of Congress, and certainly in the speech copies that were circulated beforehand. But Dylan, yeah, it is a high stakes gamble, isn't it? And I like your assessment. I agree with you. I think it's a net plus now, but if she doesn't have the receipts, it could be an albatross moving forward for her.
I mean, this could seriously ruin her personal financial situation if she ends up being in the wrong here.
Oh, absolutely. And let me ask you this, Dylan. Also targeted in that speech with as much vitriol, if not more, than the alleged predators that she cited was Attorney General Alan Wilson, her top rival for the governor's nomination here in 2026 in South Carolina. But Dylan, we pointed out in our coverage of this that this was not Alan Wilson's case, that this really didn't have anything to do with Alan Wilson, and that those criticisms were not fair. But Wilson, to his credit, I think, has adopted a sort of rope-a-dope strategy as it relates to these broadsides from Nancy Mace. How do you think Alan Wilson's handling of this is playing for him so far?
It's interesting because in the immediate hours after these attacks are leveled, when you don't see him, immediately jabbing back, you're kind of like, how is Alan just letting himself get hit like this? But I think that in the long run, not getting down in the mud will probably play well for him, especially when there is, Alan didn't do anything to get Blandon Richter's two bulldog attorneys now very publicly chasing Nancy around. Uh, he's letting other people do the response, and obviously they're not responding on Alan's behalf, but they are certainly pushing back on that narrative as a whole. Now, I think that there could be truth to the actual allegations. There is no truth to what she said about Alan, but
Mm-hmm.
him not pushing back on that directly, I think might end up being a wise decision.
Interesting. Well, again, they are the two front runners in the field. That field will be expanding over the course of the next few months. And I believe in March, this coming month, we are going to see the first announcements, formal announcements for Governor of South Carolina, which means we're going to have a lot to talk about on the show in the months to come, Dylan. But I want to shift gears now, talk about a big story that you published on our site this week that was arguably the biggest story in Washington, D.C. this past week, but ended up being a bit of a non story. And I'm referring to the release of the Jeffrey Epstein files. Epstein, of course, the financier and pedophile sex trafficker who was suicided or Clintoned. What verb are we using here? Died in his cell, jail cell. Yes, air quotes there. But Epstein's client list was scheduled to be released this week. There was much fanfare out of Washington, D.C., and we saw yesterday, just yesterday, a number of top conservative influencers emerging from the White House with binders of Jeffrey Epstein files that were supposed to be this huge reveal. Dylan, it fell flat, didn't it?
Yeah, it fell flat. Julie K. Brown, she's a reporter for the Miami Herald, who in 2017 published information that actually really advanced the ball towards Epstein's 2019 arrest. She would, I say, is the best Epstein reporter, uh, bar none. Released pretty shortly after these documents became public that None of this stuff is new. This is all stuff that's been publicly available since 2015 through civil litigation.
Yeah. So it was nothing we hadn't seen already.
Right, folks, folks who are interested in this topic who have looked at the bulk of the publicly available information were very disappointed yesterday. And this is after Attorney General Bondi decided to go on Fox News with Jesse Waters and hype this up. Oh, this is just horrific. We have so many victims' names we have to redact. And yes, it is horrific, but not new.
Yeah.
And there are really no details.
Well, and it makes the administration look like it's not on the same page because it's not on the same page. You got the FBI director and the attorney general, both of whom are less than a month in office. Kash Patel, the FBI director, days in office, publicly going at each other.
I didn't see Cash responding negatively, did he? I saw Pam send Cash a letter basically saying that his subordinates in the Southern District of New York were not providing all the evidence. I think that she's saying, go get him, Tiger.
Yeah.
I don't
Okay,
think that
that's
she
fair
was
enough.
blaming Cash for it. He's been in office for, as you say, like 72 hours.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a good point. But it's
I read that
certainly
as they're on the same team and she's telling him to go get him.
well, that's fair. Let's hope that's what it is because it certainly just looked very discombobulated from the way that it was all rolled out, and certainly those conservative influencers who I understand the
They
Trump
were made to look like absolute clowns.
absolute clowns, and this is an administration that has put a premium on advancing just those types of individuals as the new media. Elon Musk has referred to them. You are the media now, and he's not wrong. He's not wrong, but they got some egg on their face this week for sure. Um, Dylan, obviously keep us in the loop on this. And if folks haven't read Dylan's story on fitsnews.com regarding this Epstein release, it is just amazing work. Another reason why you ought to subscribe to Fitz News, not just what you get here on South Carolina coverage, but just incredibly insightful coverage of some of these bigger issues out of our nation's capital. Dylan, I can't thank you enough for that coverage. But also want to talk about a very busy session of the South Carolina General Assembly, arguably the biggest crony capitalist debacle in South Carolina history is starting to unravel. And it was once again Fitz News providing the coverage that really did it. I'm referring to the $1.3 billion. Let that sink in just for a minute. $1.3 billion given to a Volkswagen subsidiary, Scout Motors, to open an EV plant in South Carolina. If you're wondering, wait a minute, is this really the best time to be launching an electric vehicle plant? I think most people would say no. But South Carolina, in its infinite wisdom, decided not only are we going to open our doors, we're going to give this company 1.3 billion of your money to do it. And oh, by the way, Governor Henry McMaster, a proponent of the deal, has also asked for 100 million, 90 million of it recurring funding to train workers for this facility because apparently we don't have workers capable of manning these jobs, which is just again an indictment. But not only that, there is a carve out bill that they've been pushing that was handily defeated in a House subcommittee related to the sale of these EVs outside of the dealer network. And again, say what you will about the dealer network, but allowing one company to have this carve out and not allowing others, just another example of the rigged system here in South Carolina. But we were at the very forefront of this coverage. We're very happy to see so many people click on this story. It was a business story. They don't always get the traffic that the true crime stuff does, Dylan, or the salacious political stuff.
They're
But
very
it was
important, though.
hugely important. Tons of money, tons of money. And but we are going to continue to cover that Scout Motors drama as it moves forward. The latest, we are told that the money that South Carolina appropriated may actually violate the DEI restrictions in the state budget. They're not supposed to give money to taxpayer money to DEI, but apparently that Scout Motors, man, they got some serious DEI going on over there. We'll be following up on that this coming week. But Dylan, the real big issue at the State House, a battle between the trial lawyers, plaintiffs' lawyer lobby here in South Carolina, and Republican leadership in the Senate, specifically Senate Majority Leader Shane Massey. Massey has introduced a bill, lawsuit reform bill S244, that has drawn hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars already in advertisements, in political text messages being shipped out. It has just unleashed a huge battle at the State House. And Dylan, we follow this liability issue very closely. It has put a number of South Carolina businesses out of business. Obviously, it was a central part of the Murdoch case. In fact, that liability case in the Murdoch saga is what really started all of this at the state house. It's what drew lawmakers' attention to this issue and some problems with the state law. But as this battle moves forward, Dylan, we are seeing just ferocious activism on both sides, and it's going to come to a head next week because by a vote of 34-6 this week, the South Carolina Senate moved to put this bill on special order. That means it is first on the calendar when the state Senate comes back next week. A lot of folks looking at that 34-6 vote as a good sign for the bill. However, I do want to point out all that means is that these lawmakers voted to move it forward. So some of them who voted to move it forward are probably looking to weaken it or perhaps even kill it when it does get to the floor. But
And how many votes does that bill need to get out of the Senate once it's been set for special order and it hits the floor?
needs a majority, man. There's 46 senators, so they get
Well,
24
then
votes.
I mean, at that rate, he can still lose a fair amount of the folks who voted to advance it.
He could, and we've been tracking these votes carefully. In fact, we did a big story this week that puckered a lot of buttholes in the state senate related to the vote count. And there's some folks who are running for governor. Josh Kimbrell being one of them. He came on our show just last week. Josh Kimbrell is one of the waffling votes, we're told, who is considering supporting the trial lawyers on this bill. And Dylan, I got to be honest, man. Good luck trying to sell that in a Republican gubernatorial primary.
Well, that's true, but I'm sure that he's had plenty of folks in his ears. Put it that way.
Well, we'll bring him in. We'll ask him about directly. He's a great interview, and we even if we disagree on issues like that, we always love to bring him in. And certainly, I have reminded all my trial lawyer friends we've got an open mic here, folks. And so, even if you want to call us out and criticize our coverage of this issue, we welcome it. I mean, it's a public
And I think
debate.
that there's some really valid perspectives of folks who think that the insurance companies here are making a killing and are pointing at the trial lawyers and saying, "Oh, look at them, not look at us." But I think that those might both be industries which need the government to come in and clamp down on them.
I think you have hit the nail on the head there, Dylan. And you know what? I would love to have somebody come in and introduce a similar, S244 style bill on insurance. Bring it in.
Yeah, it's funny because these uh these these people who are kind of partisans, I'll call it, on this issue, people who are making their money in the insurance industry or people who are making their money as trial lawyers, they desperately want you to believe that it's an or situation. It's the insurance companies or it's the trial lawyers.
Nope.
I, having looked at this situation as somebody who doesn't make my money in either of those two industries, believe that it is an and. I think that these insurance companies are making a killing and that it's incumbent upon the state regulators to make sure that they are not onerously exacting profits at the expense of business people. But also, I mean, if you look at our tort laws in South Carolina, specifically around alcohol sales, which brings in the joint and several concerns, that is clearly imposing an onerous cost of doing business upon people who are trying to operate convenience stores, gas stations, bars, restaurants. And I'm not saying that they shouldn't be held liable if they mess up in these situations and get people hurt or killed, but there's got to be a balance between responsibility in that regard and people being able to operate businesses.
That's true. And let's also be honest. You said responsibility. Let's also get back to the real responsibility here. I mean, we've got to, at some point in our society, and we were talking earlier this week, Dylan, about this big bill, this social media bill. And Justin Bamberg, one of our good friends in the legislature, pointed
One of our
out,
favorite trial lawyers.
oh, yeah, one of our favorite plaintiff lawyers. And he pointed out, guys, you are nanny stating the role of parenting. You are literally trying to make government be the parent of your child through this bill. And oh, by the way, impose a ton of new unforeseen consequences. He's absolutely right. Dylan, at some point, we got to have personal responsibility in our society or none of this is going to work. But we're going to continue. I know time is getting short on our show. We're going to continue to cover this massive trial lawyer versus insurance industry tort battle as this legislation continues to make its way forward. And it will very soon involve Merle Smith, a guy who has been linked to some of the operatives on the trial lawyer side and put him in a very bad spot because if the Senate passes out a robust bill uh, uh, limiting the trial lawyers, they have made it abundantly clear that they believe Merle Smith is going to pull their chestnuts out of the fire, so to speak. And so
Say,
we will
Will,
be,
what does Merle Smith do professionally?
oh, yeah, what is it? Trial lawyer. There you go. One of many lawyer legislators. And I tell you, they are loaded for bear on him. If he does end up having to carry the trial lawyer water, Merle Smith is a guy who, by the way, with a lot of trial lawyer money, lost some races this past election cycle. I'm going to guess that all the lawyer money in the world is not going to help him if he's the one that's got to bail them out of this mess. But we will keep tabs on that. One quick note on Merle Smith. He has been very quiet this year on the issue of taxes. We have been waiting and waiting for something to come from him. We are informed that there is some motion in the legislature. We're not entirely sure whether it's going to be Smith or someone in the Senate, but we are told there could be some motion coming forward on some substantial tax relief. And Merle Smith has said that is one of his priorities. And I do want to make clear if he or any other member of the legislature makes good on that promise, we will absolutely give them the credit they deserve because taxes really just like the tort climate, a serious issue inhibiting
And
our
we're talking
competitiveness.
about like complaining about Scout getting allocated all this state money. And this is a way that our legislature can encourage businesses to move to this state organically, where they don't pick winners or losers, is to give us a favorable tax environment so that folks, whether they be small business proprietors living in other states, they might be really concerned about the personal income tax rate. That's what they're addressing here. But also,
Mhm.
your corporate income tax rate is really important. So it's very encouraging to hear that apparently these legislators are serious about bringing these things down, because that is how, instead of having these crony capitalist deals which are rife with corruption where they get to pick the winners and losers and then keep a ridiculously high tax rate for everybody else, no, you
Yeah.
bring the rate down. You do what, I mean, look at how well it's worked for a state like Florida for the last couple of decades. Once they've implemented this policy, they've had businesses moving in droves, and businesses that, if the part-time legislators tried to pick winners and losers, they could have never encouraged to move to the state. That is what we need to be doing in South Carolina, and it seems like they're actually moving in that direction, which is really encouraging.
Well, and also, Dylan, both of these debates, whether it's tort reform, whether it's tax reform, hopefully relief, it all boils down to fundamental fairness. And obviously, it's a moving target as far as when you hear the spin doctors start putting out their side of things. But that's one of the reasons Fitz News, I think, is so important, is having that open microphone to anyone on any side of these issues that they can come in and say, look, this is why I think this is fair. This is why I think that isn't fair. And so I'm very proud of the work that we do, not only breaking news regarding these debates, putting our 2 cents in, but also opening that microphone to everybody that's got an intelligent take on it. And
I did have
our,
another fun State House piece this month. I got one up about they're trying to regulate the use of drones for hunting hogs and coyotes. So if you're a drone operator or a hunter, head over to fitznews.com and check that piece out. It was a fun one to write.
okay, you had some good stuff this week, man. Just a great effort all week by our crew, Dylan, you, Jen, Andy, Callie, the whole team. Again, cannot be prouder of the work that we're doing here. Once again, driving the debate in South Carolina, driving a lot of the other mainstream media coverage. And again, if you want to support us in what we're doing, folks, it's so critical. We are a site that lives by those subscriptions. So your support is really what empowers everything that we do here. And again, only $8 a month. Your subscription helps us hold folks accountable here in the Palmetto State. So I want to thank everybody who does subscribe and encourage you, if you haven't already, please go to fitznews.com and subscribe today. It really helps us hold folks accountable. That is a wrap for this edition of the show. I want to thank everybody for tuning in. We will be back in the Fitz News studios next week for our regularly scheduled weekend review, and look forward to bringing you all the big stories that we've been covering again here at fitznews.com. We'll catch you next time on the month in review.